Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this talk. So this is actually about Workload Identity Federation. And a quick show of hands if anyone is actually using Workload Identity Federation in production. Not yet. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm Jenisten. I'm working in a company called Full Creative. It's a product-based company. I have like over 10 years of experience working in this company. And I actually started into networking, and I also switched into a little bit of cloud, GCP. And I also have a little bit of security. I was working in security in my company itself. I was doing pen tests, and we were like trying to break web applications. And then we moved into DevOps with the intent of bringing in a DevSecOps practice. And at the same time, I'm also a GDG cloud organizer. And I really thank the entire SRE team for giving me this opportunity. And my areas of focus are DevOps, SRE, cloud, and also AI. In my company, Full Creative, we are a product-based company. We have about 300 plus GCP applications and production GCP applications. And we have close to 200 repositories that are being used, active repositories. And we have been facing a problem of how we can actually have a secure environment with respect to securing the keys and like what are the secrets that are actually available in our CI/CD pipeline. We use GitHub as a source code management, and our entire CI/CD pipeline is in GitHub Actions. And this is going to be a little bit overview of our talk here. These are the sections that I am going to be covering. So let's start with the challenges. When you talk about secret accounts and their corresponding keys, so you would have used keys in your production environments for doing deployments, right? So can you think of any problems that can come up with the keys that we have in our environments? Rotations. Exposure, okay. Cool, you all are right. This is the scenario where it all started. In our environment, we have, since I was actually explaining about the environments that we have, there was a scenario where I was trying to work on building a CI/CD pipeline for publish-based workflows. And then we ran into a scenario where I accidentally exposed a security key secret from the environment through GitHub Actions. It was not an accident. I was trying to see if that setup would work, and I was able to break it. That became like a POC for exposing a credential from GitHub's environment itself. Basically, this is your personal machine. We are using it for doing manual deployments. You are able to have the, let's say if it is your Gmail account or whatever account it may be, AWS account, you have the development environment set up in your system with which you are able to do it. But when it is an external system, you have to prepare that system for this environment to do an active deployment, isn't it? So that is how I was actually trying to do it, and that's how I was able to make it as a POC to expose a credential which is inside the GCP environment itself, from which we have actually stored it as a secret in GitHub, basically, right? I was actually reporting this. The previous screenshot was my report that I sent to the GitHub support, and this is the response that we have received in the year 2023. So basically, the scenario was, if at all you wanted to identify and expose secret inside the source code or anywhere, either your repository has to be a public repository or you have to have an enterprise license to use the secret scanner. So with which, how can we are actually using the teams-based plan. So not all companies might go into an enterprise scenario because the cost is like at least 3 times higher, whatever that GitHub is doing for the GitHub, we have to pay it for GitHub, right? But yeah, that's actually a lengthy email. So that's the background story with which we started. And basically in terms of the Workload Identity Federation, we would have a vehicle, we would use a car. And let's say what happens when you do not have the keys and someone has the keys. They will basically be able to drive the vehicle without any issues, isn't it? This is the underlying story behind whatever that we are going to talk about here. How can we prevent such a scenario from happening in terms of cloud? Whenever someone has a credential, how can we stop them from misusing it? As you rightly said, these are a couple of other challenges that I have also mentioned here. The key rotations and the credential leakage, yes, you were right. And at the same time, there are other some less impactful scenarios where it is going to affect the reputation, where anyone can spoof with respect to getting access to your service account credentials and stuff. And the privilege escalation, where you have exposure of the resources. You basically, when it is exposed, it's already understood that some of our resources are being exposed, right? And misconfiguration is one. So when you may, let's say, if the least privilege access method isn't being followed here, the exposed credential will have a potential to expose multiple other things, which comes into the misconfiguration category, right? So these are the couple of challenges that this service is going to help us to solve. So the solution, Workload Identity Federation, it is actually a service. I will be explaining a little bit more about this in the upcoming slides, but simply put, when someone has the keys, even though they have the keys, it is going to be having an extra validation where we are going to verify the identity of the person who's going to use it. So similarly, like in our case, the credentials that even though when it is getting exposed, it will be of no use. There is an additional layer of verification that is going to be there, and at the same time, GitHub is actually making it really close to impossible, where once it is generated and once the workflow is getting completed and once the workflow shuts down, you wouldn't be able to use that to perform any other action because it's like a short-lived access token. So yeah, now I think it's the right time to understand how it works. These are a couple of key terminologies that I would like to walk through before explaining how the service itself is going to work. So that is an identity provider. Identity provider is basically an external system. Any other system, like maybe not the cloud that we are using, not AWS or GCP, but it is going to be GitHub or GitLab or whatever that is going to be supporting the OIDC, OpenID Connect standard. Workload identity pool is going to be like, maybe you can take it as an example of an entire bucket where you are going to have a lot of configurations with respect to, it's not an actual storage bucket, but an actual plastic bucket, a scenario like that, just as in comparison, right? So you are going to have all of your identities that are going to be saved with respect to all the configurations, whichever is allowed for your environments to communicate and then get the short-lived access token. The identity provider is going to be the Google or AWS, or there are multiple other identity providers that are out there, which is going to host your production system, where the identity provider is going to be playing the role of validating the incoming request basically. So whether the incoming request is valid, can we give a short-lived access token to it, and maybe can we help them to process the deployment or whatever request that is actually incoming. Security token service is the kind of the service that is doing the validation and the communication between the keys. So maybe when the service wants to give a key, security service is going to give them the key, which means the external provider, identity provider, the key. Federated token is the token that is being used, which means it is going to be a very short-lived access token, and it is going to be only active for the time when you are going to do the deployment. Once the deployment is completed and once the execution is completed, it will no longer be of use even though it is at the wrong hands. And so yeah, these are a couple of identity providers: Active Directory Federation Service, Okta, Azure, or any service that is going to support OIDC, OpenID Connect. And also there are a couple of other workload identity providers, AWS, GCP, GitHub, GitLab, all of these are going to be the identity providers as well. This is the basic flow diagram where this OIDC standard is going to be helping us to communicate between the identity provider and the workload identity federation itself. So in our case, the first setup that we are going to configure is going to be the trust at the cloud provider standard, be it AWS or GCP or any other service to which we are going to do the deployment, where the OIDC trust is the kind of the configuration that we are going to ensure that, okay, this is going to be the identity provider and this is how the configuration is going to be, and whatever the configuration that is required to identify the external system to the internal system where we are going to do it. And GitHub Actions workflow is where it is going to get initiated, because our deployment, the CI/CD pipeline is in our GitHub Actions itself. It is going to make the request, and that request is going to have the JSON web token, all of the information that GitHub is going to generate during the execution to give it to the cloud provider, which is through the OIDC Connect itself. And once the cloud provider receives that incoming request, we will have the fourth step. It is going to validate it. It is going to give a short-lived access token. Using that access token, we are going to perform the deployment, and then it's completely going to get destroyed. So this is the flow. And maybe I'll actually go through all of these. I'll probably walk you through the entire setup, how it is actually being done inside the GCP console itself. And we have been using this specific setup for over 100 plus projects which are in production, and this has actually helped us to reduce a lot of manual overload. We do not have to worry about rotating credentials once in 3 months, and we do not worry about exposing credentials anywhere. Bunch of other key opportunities that is actually helping us in a way. And maybe to get started, we are going to enable this GCP service, and there is also a new pattern where we are going to use we are not going to use an existing service account. We are going to create a new service account which is going to be with the name. You can actually choose any name. In my case, I have chosen GitHub Action Workload Identity Federation as the name of the service account itself. SREday is the GCP project that I have created, and I am going to equip that service account with Google, the Cloud Run Invoker, and Workload Identity User as 2 roles that are going to be required. Cloud Run Invoker, with which I am going to do in my case, I can do a Cloud Run deployment, or maybe in any case, whatever the role that is required. Let's say if it is App Engine, if it's a VM, the corresponding roles can be configured. In this case, I just chose to do with a Cloud Run deployment. And so now that with that specific setup, we are going to move into setting up the workload identity pool as we saw in the prerequisite. So this is where we are going to get started with the workload identity pool. And so I am going to create an identity pool which says GitHub Actions CI/CD, like how it is here. And I just gave a sample description in our SREday project. With that, we are going to configure the identity provider. In our case, we are going to use the OIDC standard, and GitHub is going to be our provider. This is actually the URL that is actually available in the GitHub's documentation itself. Every OIDC provider who is identity provider who is going to follow that standard will have a similar URL. And in our case, we have this URL from the GitHub documentation. And by the time when we start configuring this thing, we are going to have the audience URL as this entire URL that it is actually there. We will come back to this URL in the next section actually. And so there are a couple of attributes. So let's say we are configuring the workload identity pool, but how do we restrict, okay, these are the specific people who can actually communicate to this pool. This is the configuration that is going to allow us to that is making it possible basically. So let's say if on the whole, if you are an entire product-based company, you are going to have 100 plus repositories, you can basically whitelist the identity pool for that specific organization. Or if you wanted to segregate it based on repository, even that is possible. So for a specific repository, you can actually have a dedicated identity pool, or maybe for a group of repositories also you can have an identity pool. But if you wanted to segregate them based on identity pools, you can still do it. You can create different identity pools for different customers basically, right? In my case, I was trying to use the repository, so the very bare minimum configuration. So even any other repository, if at all I'm trying to communicate to this identity pool, it cannot do it. And the first one is actually default one, which Google has to have it. The second one is going to, it's just the comparison between all of these are CEL expressions. Even Google has, this one is actually from the Google's documentation, Google's official documentation about CEL expressions. Configuring inside the workload identity federation is actually a little bit vast, which you can actually explore, but it's quite simple, quite easy. With all of these 4 configurations itself, I am able to connect to a repository. If at all there is specific use cases, the corresponding documentation will actually help in fixing that. Now that with those specific configurations, once the identity pool is getting created, this is how we are going to see it. We are just going to see the principal entity here. This is also something that we saw it in the previous slides, that it had a very big URL. This is how the principal is being created. The data which from the identity provider is going to be passed to this principal, and then it is going to be validated, and it is going to use that for validation of that specific repository, or maybe all the repositories in your organization. This was the configuration that I was actually saying about. So once when we connected to a service, you can have the entire organization with all the list of repositories, or you can have only one. In my case, it's my GitHub repository with the corresponding GitHub organization, or my account with the corresponding repository that we have here. This is just a screenshot. So with that, I'll go for the demo. So this is my repository here, and probably I'll come back here. Please give me 1 sec while I just switch. Maybe I'll just open it here itself. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yes, this is the service accounts that I have created. You can see there is one service account that is going to be used for a deployment, and I'm just going to do a comparison of both the setups here. You can just do a direct deployment, or you can use the workload identity federation. So the direct deployment has the corresponding roles for a Cloud Run deployment as well, and also the workload identity federation has the two roles that we have configured here. And the next thing, so just to let you know that about the key that we have created on the deploy service account, we have the key. On the workload identity federation, we do not, because that is what it is going to use the workload identity federation service itself. And so here is the workload identity federation configuration that we have configured for performing our deployment. Basically, we can get started with the add provider and we can do it. I'll just quickly walk through the existing configuration here, the way how we have used it. This was all of the information that it is all required for this configuration to work, and I just whitelisted it only for this specific repository. So just for the use case of it, since we wanted to have this scenario only for the workload identity federation and not for any cloud and deployments, I just have that specific step that we are going to walk through. So this is going to be the default login that we are going to have for the GCP direct deployment itself. In this case, we are just going to, this is the specific step that is going to do the authentication, where we can see I am getting the credentials from GCP SA key that is being passed into the GitHub Actions workflow. And I also require the GCP project. All of those two things are being stored inside the environments with which we are actually going to do the direct deployment. And this is the modified version where the same step is being used, except we are going to use the workload identity federation provider and the workload identity federation service account. I will do a sample commit and I'll walk through the executions of it. So I just committed the changes to the GitHub repository. So all these things were the preparations that I had at the start of the day, and these are two commits. So one, we are able to see legacy authentication, by which I am referring to the authentication that is being done on the service account with the key. The workload identity federation is the configuration that is not with the key, instead the workload identity federation service itself. So with these two things, we are able to see here on this configuration, we are able to see that for the authentication step, the credential is being obtained and it is being stored in this file on the GitHub Actions runner, with which the authentication itself is happening. Basically, I am using the service account here. The credentials JSON, the environment that we have passed here, is the one that is actually getting the service account and then passing it, and with which the authentication is happening, and then we are able to see that it is authenticated. And I would have added a step to see what is the project that I have mentioned here, and the current project is SREday. But in the actual workload identity federation, I am not going to use that specific thing. Instead, the authentication is actually configured at the using the service account and the workload identity federation provider. So this is the entire string that I was actually showing it on the previous slide, where you are going to have the configuration with respect to the providers and the workload identity pool itself. So in my use case, we are able to use the workload identity federation provider, create a short-lived access token, and that is going to be stored here, even though it has access. By the time during the execution, this credential, the file is being created. Once the actions runner is done, you will no longer, it is basically a short-lived access token that is given by Google following the OIDC standard itself. I will also just show the setups that I have created for this specific thing. In my repository settings, I have both the service account key and a token for reading the npm packages basically, and I do have an environment which is the production environment. Inside that environment, I have just two variables: the GCP project ID as a variable and the service account as a variable as well. So these are the two things that are actually that we are using, the Workload Identity Federation itself is using to perform the deployment itself, where, or maybe to the authentication step to the GCP itself, where it doesn't require any manual intervention of having an actual service account and then doing it. All right. Now that we are able to see that we are able to perform the authentication for GCP, anything is possible with the specific setup, and we are no longer going to get our hands dirty with creating service accounts, creating the keys. Sorry, we are going to create service accounts, but not the keys that we are going to do, and maybe rotating all of the issues that we actually notice, the challenges that we notice is no longer going to be a problem for us here. And there are a few best practices that we still have to follow. Least privilege access method, as you already know. And in my example, I was actually using a dedicated project. But in the case of a production, again, for having all of these configurations, the workload identity pools, you can actually have a dedicated project for it. You can have that to handle all the incoming requests with respect to the identity federation, and you can use that instead, rather than actually having it and in the actual project. There isn't any harm, but when you wanted to have it on a production scale, multiple applications looking out for that specific pool, this is actually better. And yeah, regular audits with respect to if there is any the access that is given, or if the access is being given properly, or if the roles are configured properly, if there is any additional roles that are given to that specific service account, as regular audits. And yeah, it is also recommended that we go with trusted providers, not with any standard, any that doesn't follow the OIDC standard. Please do not go ahead with that. Maybe as it is a OIDC is an open standard, any application can come up with it, but just ensure the trustworthiness of that specific service. And yeah, single provider, you can have, do not, so let's, in your use case, every repository can have a single provider if they are different customers, but if they are same customers, just have one provider and probably have everything to map to that, because the configuration is just only with the name of the repository that we are going to pass in. And the last point is actually the impersonation step, where this is a role which we are actually configuring to that specific service account. By the time when we create a service account, we are going to set it with an impersonation step. Ensure that this specific role is actually not given to a specific user, because by the time when we have this role assigned to an user, or basically to any other role, and if the user or a service account has this role, a service account should have this role, but the user should not have this role. If at all you wanted to prevent the developers from overriding this thing, where if they have a service account with an impersonation access, they basically will be able to use that service account for a deployment in your local itself, rather than using it. That completely breaks the entire idea of actually having automated deployments as in the CI/CD pipeline itself. And revocation, we don't worry about revocation anymore with this thing. And yeah, revocation actually, if at all there is any service that any identity pool that you no longer want to support to, any repository that you no longer want to support to, all of those should come into your regular audits, where we have to ensure and remove that specific thing from the identity pool configuration. And I was actually talking about the production use case, where we are going to configure multiple repositories into one identity pool. There is a policy binding that is required, and we were only able to see that it was actually available in the CLI. We weren't able to identify it in the UI itself, the GCP console itself. And basically in this case, we have to create a service account in the actual project, and assuming that we have a centralized pool and we are going to map multiple repositories or multiple projects to that pool, this is a policy binding step that is mandatory in production use cases. So there are three parameters that we have to use here: the GCP, the GitHub Action Workload Identity Federation service account that is corresponding for that project, not the common identity pool project, and the actual development project, the GCP project itself. And the final configuration is the GitHub org and the repository name. So whatever repository that we are going to access, that specific configuration has to be done on the identity pool project, where we have the workload identity federation itself. On that project, we have to do this configuration itself. And so yeah, with that we have these key takeaways. So no longer service accounts, and with that we are actually having a strong security focus in mind, like following a shift left approach. And because we are going to use short-lived federated tokens here, and this is going to ensure trust, we are going to be able to support. So now that workload identity federation is there, you will have facilities to connect GCP cloud requests, AWS requests into GCP the other way around as well. and any other service provider for that matter. So be it multi-cloud, be it on-prem services, as far as you are following the OIDC standard, you will be able to connect it to GCP or any other workload identity providers. And it gives a better developer experience basically, and you are going to have a lesser attack surface, because by the time when you have to configure the key for a deployment inside a GitHub repository, you are going to download it locally and then convert it to base64, put it into the repository secrets. All of those hassle is no longer required, and you do not have to worry about having this key being exposed anywhere. So yeah, with that, I convey my sincere thanks to all of you and also to the organizers. And if there is any questions, we can talk about it, and feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We can discuss further on this as well. For the organizations, I don't think you would be able to scale Workload Identity Federation as a service, because it is going to be connected to the organization and all the projects inside that organization. So as far as there are multiple projects inside that organization, one identity pool is sufficient. But if it is multiple organizations, you may have to have individual workload identity pools configured to that specific thing, as you cannot scale it like that. Yes, yes. So it is going to be following the service account, as far as you are going to have one common identity pool, and you are going to create a new service account on the corresponding project to communicate between to communicate to the actual pool. So let's say it is a production use case, and all of the 100 repositories inside one organization can communicate to one project that has a workload identity federation concept, the pool itself. So you will be creating a new service account from your project to the, and then using a policy binding that we have here, you will have to communicate from the, so the workload action WIF service account is on your actual project. With that, you are going to pass in this entire, the principal set. With this is actually the policy binding, where that GCP project, the actual dev project, is connected to the workload identity pool. And once this is set up, I think you are good to start with it. So the pool configuration is only one is going to be done once. This configuration for every project that you are going to do is just one line of this thing. We can easily scale it. Okay. Actually, this is on the service account and not on the users. We don't have to have the, if you have users, the ultimate goal of having a CI/CD in place itself is not actually going to be working out, because they do not have to focus on a deployment. They, the developers, if they wanted to do a deployment, the CI/CD should be there to take this in place, and inside the CI/CD, the service account is going to play the role for it, not the actual users thing, the access thing.
Any more questions? Okay, that's conclude. Yeah, thanks, Justin, for your presentation. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much.